1. The bell tolled twice for murder when Miss Clementine West came to Bramwell Parva. In the last week of June, the village was full of bells. They were not, to begin with, the bells themselves, though one heard those often enough from St. Jude's Tower, but bells as a subject, bells as a grievance, bells as a triumph, bells as the proper object of subscriptions, committees, tea-tray debates, and elderly conviction. Bramwell Parva, like many English villages, could turn any matter into a moral issue if given a little time and a little weather, and the restoration of the church bells had provided both. The afternoon Miss West arrived, the sky was a pale and benevolent blue, the hedges held the dust of summer in their leaves, and the broad square tower of St. Jude's rose over the village elms with the air of having seen far more of human nonsense than it had ever chosen to discuss. A peal of practice ringing rolled out over the green as the bus drew up, and Miss West, stepping down with a neat brown suitcase and a folded umbrella, paused a moment to listen. "Still at it," said a cheerful voice. "If they ring much more enthusiastically, my dear Clementine, the dead in the churchyard will begin to complain of being over-summoned." Mrs. Hester Peake, stout, bright-eyed and untidy, in a way that suggested she had never seen why objects should remain where one had put them, kissed her old friend affectionately on both cheeks and seized the suitcase before Miss West could protest. "My dear Hester," said Miss West, smiling, "if I had known there would be bells to greet me, I should have brought an archbishop." "Nonsense. You have always been much more useful." They went together to Hester's little motor car, which had been elderly 10 years before, and now resembled a determined biscuit tin on wheels. As they drove slowly up the high street, the village arranged itself in the late sunlight in a manner almost suspiciously picturesque. There was the duck pond with its greenish dignity, the row of red brick cottages with climbing roses over the lintels, the tea shop with striped blinds and window boxes, the post office where cards, cough sweets, bootlasses and local information were dispensed with roughly equal solemnity, and beyond the green a lane leading up to Bel Air Court, the principal house in the neighbourhood, and, as Hester had already written in 3 separate letters, the principal source of discomfort. "Who is fighting with whom?" Miss West asked, as they turned into the lane. "My dear, one must not rush at life so directly. Let me at least get you home and give you tea before I begin dividing the parish into factions." Miss West, who knew perfectly well that Hesters would divide the parish into factions whether or not tea intervened, folded her gloves in her lap and looked out towards Bel Air Court. It was a large mid-Victorian house of grey stone, a little too solid to be beautiful, and a little too self-conscious to be charming, though time and ivy had softened both defects. There were broad lawns descending from a terrace, chestnut trees at the side, and a long west front catching the evening light in a series of dignified, watchful windows. The place suggested that money had arrived in the family, not with old grace, but with firm intention. Houses of that sort often held more control than affection. "That," said Hester, following her glance, "is where it all comes from. Mrs. Augusta Harbury, widow, benefactress, tyrant, ornament of the church bazaar, terror of the infirm of character, and patroness of the bells. Patroness, she paid for almost half the restoration when the appeal began to fail. If she had not, Leonard Pike would still be delivering speeches about spiritual duty and unpaid invoices. As it is, everyone thanks her in public and resents her in private, which is often the ideal position for influence." Miss West made a small sound, "And who is Leonard Pike?" "The churchwarden, treasurer of the Bell Fund, organiser of flower rotas, examiner of church kneelers, guardian of liturgical dignity, and in his own opinion very nearly the last remaining upright man in England. How fatiguing. Yes, I have always thought so. Hester's cottage, Willow Cottage, stood in a side lane bordered by lavender and a white paling fence that had once been carefully maintained and was now being maintained in theory. It was comfortable, full of polished small tables and remembered friendships, and smelled pleasantly of tea leaves, furniture wax and old books. Miss West had scarcely removed her hat before Hester had installed her in the drawing-room with a tray-bearing teapot, seed cake, shortbread and gooseberry jam. "Now, said Hester, pouring. "You must know everyone, otherwise you will miss the point." My dear, said Miss West, accepting tea, in villages one never misses the point. One only mistakes it for another. That is exactly why I need you here. She leaned back and began, with the air of a woman unrolling a carpet. Mrs. Augusta Harbury, mistress of Bel-Air Court, was 68, wealthy, clear-headed, imperious, charitable on a large scale and almost never kind in a small one. Her husband had died 20 years earlier after a married life thought by the village to have been successful, chiefly because he was rarely consulted. Augusta had no children. Her nearest relation was her nephew Giles Harbury, who lived at the court and possessed what Hester described as all the virtues of a charming liability. Giles was about 35, handsome in a manner which had probably once looked romantic at school, and now looked expensive, intelligent without industry, and unfortunate in undertakings involving cards, horses, or the assumption that money could be coaxed into endurance. Then there was Miss Violet Dean, paid companion to Mrs. Harbury for 4 years, competent, self-contained, dark-haired and so discreet that village opinion had decided she must conceal either a great sorrow or a very determined nature. Mrs. Edith Crome, the housekeeper, had been at Bel-Air Court since before the war and disapproved of nearly everybody with the steadiness of a grandfather clock. Leonard Pike, as already indicated, was churchwarden and treasurer of the Bell Restoration Fund. He was 55, neat, exact, a widower, and one of those men whom villagers trust because they can be relied upon to know the location of hymn books and the price of roofing slate to the halfpenny. Dr. Julian Fane, the village doctor, rented the elms, cycled everywhere, and had the dry manner of a man who had spent too many years being summoned to ailments that were moral in origin and physical in complaint. The rector, Mr. Simon Bell, was amiable and gentle, with a face like a puzzled sheepdog and a memory slightly less reliable than the vestry key. His sister, Miss Dora Bell, kept house for him, managed the parish by indirection, and was believed by some to have been born old. Excellent, said Miss West. Now tell me who hates whom. My dear Clementine, one does not hate in villages. One endures with concentration. Still, there are tensions. Giles has been asking his aunt for money. Augusta has lately refused him. Violet Dean has given notice. Mrs. Harbury is said to have altered her will more than once this spring. Leonard Pike and Mrs. Harbury have had words over the Bell accounts. Dr. Fane quarrelled with Augusta over the care of old Mrs. Purvis, who died last month, and left the village in no position to arbitrate. Mrs. Gell from the post office says there is something odd about the subscription list, but Mrs. Gell would say there was something odd about the 12 apostles if she had the seating plan. Miss West tasted the shortbread. Why has Miss Dean given notice? Because, according to Edith Crome, Mrs. Harbury has become impossible, which may only mean exactly as she always was. And the will, Hester lowered her voice instinctively, although the room was empty. It is said Augusta meant to see her solicitor on Monday after the Bell rededication. Some think she intended to punish Giles, some that she meant to reward Violet, and some that she wished to leave Bel-Air Court to the church in order to terrify everyone equally. Miss West smiled faintly. That would be a very rich Anglican revenge. The bells began again as the light deepened outside. The sound rolled through the open window, sometimes splendid, sometimes uncertain. Miss West sat still, head slightly inclined. She had always thought bells rather revealing. Their meaning was public, but their effect intimate. A bell might call a parish to worship, announce a wedding, mark the dead, or merely remind a village that time had gone on without consulting it. In each case, however, the hearer supplied half the emotion. "You are thinking," said Hester. "Yes. What? That a benefactress who has altered her will, dismissed her dependents, quarrelled with her treasurer, and continues to support a handsome nephew is not likely to enjoy a quiet summer." "My dear," cried Hester, delighted. "That is exactly what I hoped you would say." The next 2 days passed in that English country fashion which seems at first idle, and is really a steady accumulation of evidence. Miss West strolled about the village with Hester, accepted introductions, admired gardens, inspected the church, drank tea in 3 different houses, and by the second evening knew more about Bramwell Parva than most people learn in a year. At the tea shop she met Mrs. Beatrice Gell, who ran the post office in partnership with Observation. Mrs. Gell wore black silk in honour of a husband dead 12 years, and wielded information with the piety of a collector preserving rare china. "So pleased," she said, while offering scones. "Hester tells me you have known many places." "A few," said Miss West. "Well, you will find us very quiet here." "No doubt," said Miss West, which caused Hester to cough into her teacup. At the rectory, Miss Dora Bell informed her that a restoration of the bells would have been achieved much sooner if men on committees did not insist on making speeches before paying bills. "It is not ringing that exhausts me," Miss Dora said. "It is gratitude. Everyone expects one to feel it in public and indefinitely." Mr. Simon Bell, hearing this from the hall, looked grieved and dropped a tray of hymn books. On Friday afternoon, Miss West paid a first call at Bel-Air Court. Hester, being on excellent terms with Augusta Harbury in the way that two women can be on excellent terms while privately considering one another impossible, had arranged it without difficulty. The drawing-room of Bel-Air Court was long, cool, and a little oppressive in its elegance. There were high windows opening on to the terrace, Persian rugs, family portraits of serious men and ironic women, and so many perfectly placed objects that one felt the room must continue thinking itself arranged even when empty. Mrs. Augusta Harbury received them from a high-backed chair with the air of a queen who has accepted constitutional limitations, but only as a temporary inconvenience. She had beautiful silver hair, a firm profile, and pale eyes that assessed rather than welcomed. "So this is Miss West," she said. "Hester writes of you as though you were a specialist brought in for delicate faults in human machinery." "My dear Mrs. Harbury," said Miss West mildly, "no machinery in the world is as delicate as the human kind, and none breaks down more noisily." Mrs. Harbury laughed, a quick intelligent laugh not at all softened by warmth. "Sit down. Tea, Violet." Miss Violet Dean moved forward from a side table with graceful efficiency. She was about 40, dark, composed, and wore a dove-grey dress which suited her controlled face. There was something in her manner that suggested not meekness, but discipline. Miss West liked her at once, and distrusted that liking for being too swift. Giles Harbury came in a few minutes later, handsome and untidy in a way that implied charm rather than negligence. He kissed his aunt's cheek, nodded to Hester, and said to Miss West, "I am told you are observant. I shall therefore do my best to look innocent." "My dear Mr. Harbury," said Miss West, "looking innocent is usually a mistake. It attracts interest." He laughed. Violet did not. Tea was served. Mrs. Harbury spoke of the bells, of village apathy, of committee blunders, and of the criminal incompetence of modern craftsmen who could never be persuaded to finish anything on schedule unless threatened by the Almighty and 3 solicitors. Hester contributed stories. Giles contributed lightness. Violet contributed accuracy. Yet under all of it, Miss West sensed strain. When Giles asked carelessly whether the solicitor from Medchester would still be coming on Monday, Mrs. Harbury replied without looking at him, "If my arrangements continue to require intelligence, certainly." Giles's smile altered only a little. "My dear aunt, you have always had a touching faith that legal paper can improve family character. It can at least prevent it from becoming expensive." Violet looked down at the teapot. Hester began at once to discuss hydrangeas. Later, on the terrace, while Hester admired the rose standards, and Augusta instructed the gardener, Miss West found herself beside Violet Dean. "You have a very beautiful garden," she said. "It is Mrs. Harbury's pride, and your work, no doubt." Violet gave a slight smile. "In houses like this one never claims credit. One merely gets blamed in proportion." "Very true." There was a pause. The long border blazed with delphiniums and white lilies. From somewhere near the stables came the sound of a motor being unsuccessfully persuaded into cooperation. "Will the bell ceremony be very elaborate tomorrow?" Miss West asked. "As elaborate as Mr. Pike can make it," Violet said. "There will be speeches. There are always speeches. You do not enjoy them?" "I enjoy almost nothing that involves public gratitude." Again the answer was neat, self-contained. But Miss West had the distinct impression that Violet was tired to the edge of decision. As they left Bel-Air Court, Hester said under her breath, "Well, Mrs. Harbury has the gift," said Miss West. Of making everybody in a room feel selected for judgment. Yes, but what did you really think? 1. That Miss Dean is leaving because she has reached the end of some inward tether, that Giles is worried, and that your Mrs. Harbury likes to settle matters in a dramatic key. My dear Clementine, you have unpacked the whole drawing room. 1. Not at all. Only its most portable contents. Saturday, the day of the bell rededication, began with sunshine of a peculiarly English kind, radiant, tentative, and not quite to be trusted after luncheon. 1. By 11, the lawns at Bel-Air Court had become the site of a fete so carefully organised that chaos flourished in every corner of it. There were striped stalls, trestle tables of jam and cakes, bunting between the cedar trees. 1. A tombola under the yews, and a white-painted sign directing visitors to the church tower in parties of 6. Children ran as children always do, in patterns that appear entirely random until one notices that they orbit sugar. 1. Elderly ladies stood behind stalls of embroidery and raffles with the fixed benevolence of women defending civilization at small change. The men moved chairs, fetched boxes. 1. And explained things to one another, in the tones of those who had never discovered how often women had already done them. Miss West, accompanied by Hester, and carrying a programme she had no intention of consulting. 1. Wandered through the fete with attentive composure. At the produce table, Mrs. Gell murmured that Giles Harbury had been seen in Medchester on Thursday coming out of the bank with an expression most unsuitable to solvency. 1. Near the tea tent, Miss Dora Bell confided that Mr. Pike had insisted upon rearranging the order of bell-ringing demonstrations 3 times since breakfast, and would probably expire eventually of rectitude. 1. On the west lawn, Dr. Julian Fane said, when introduced, "If any one of these children falls off the donkey cart, I shall blame religion," which caused Miss West to consider him favourably. He was a lean man in his early 40s, dark-haired, 1. Keen-faced, and lightly worn by the practice of medicine among people who expected both miracles and economy. There was good humour in him, but it had to be looked for behind impatience, like sunlight behind moving cloud. 1. You are Hester's friend, he said. I hope she has not told you all our sins already. Only the social ones, said Miss West. She is saving the moral for rainy weather. That is considerate. They were interrupted by Mrs. Harbury, 1. Who came across the lawn with a briskness that made several people unconsciously clear a path. Dr. Fane, I have not seen the first aid tent inspected. It has been inspected. By whom? By me. Mrs. Harbury absorbed this, 1. Found no immediate opening for further correction, and turned to Miss West. You see what one must endure. If I were not exact, everything here would be run on enthusiasm and cake crumbs. It often is, said Miss West. 1. Mrs. Harbury looked at her sharply, then laughed again in that quick, hard way. At noon there was a ringing display in the church. Leonard Pike presided, standing near the porch in a dark suit and carrying typed notes. He spoke clearly, 1. Exactly, and without visible vanity, which in his case made the vanity more evident rather than less. The oldest bell in St. Jude's dates from 1672, he told the assembled villagers. The Sanctus bell, 1. Rung separately from the lower chamber, is considerably earlier and is used only for specific ceremonial purposes. I must ask visitors not to touch the ropes. 1. A small boy touched a rope almost immediately and was removed by Miss Dora Bell with the speed of liturgical correction. Miss West observed Leonard Pike carefully. He was one of those men who gave the impression of order polished daily. 1. His hair was iron grey and carefully brushed, his collar immaculate, his manner controlled. He spoke to Mrs. Harbury with respect that stopped just short of warmth. He spoke to Giles with tolerance faintly sharpened by judgment. 1. He spoke to Violet with the formal care of a man conscious of female presence and determined not to show it. Such men often considered themselves morally plain, and were generally nothing of the kind. In the tower chamber, 1. When the party had been allowed up, Miss West noticed the arrangement of the ropes. The main ring hung above, descending from the ringing room, but in the lower chamber off the stair there was a separate rope, smoother from different use. 1. The Sanctus, said Leonard Pike, seeing her glance. Rung from here, quite distinct in tone from the great bell, though few outsiders know the difference. I dare say villagers do, Miss West replied. He smiled faintly. 1. Villagers hear what they expect. Very true, said Miss West, storing the remark away. During the afternoon, the fete proceeded with every sign of success and every symptom of strain. 1. Giles Harbury won a ridiculous quantity of things by smiling at the right ladies. Violet Dean managed the refreshments with silent competence. Mrs. Crome moved through the house and terrace like an offended providence. 1. Dr. Fane bandaged a grazed knee, advised an old gentleman against eating a 4th sausage roll, and was seen later in earnest conversation with Mrs. Harbury near the herbaceous border. Leonard Pike kept counting things. 1. Hester kept noticing people, notice other people. At one point Miss West, resting for a moment near the cedar, saw a brief exchange that interested her. Mrs. Harbury stood apart near the croquet hoops. 1. Holding a folded paper in one gloved hand. Leonard Pike came up to her. She said something Miss West could not hear. Pike's expression changed, not much. 1. But enough to show the tightening of a man who has been contradicted on ground he considers his own. Mrs. Harbury held out the paper. He did not take it. After a moment she put it back into her handbag and turned away. Did you see that? 1. Miss West murmured. Of course I saw it, said Hester, who had materialized beside her with 2 glasses of lemonade. The whole lawn saw it. The only question is whether it was about money, church linen, or the Day of Judgment. 1. My guess would be money, said Miss West. At 4 o'clock she found herself again beside Violet Dean at the cake table. You are very busy, Miss West said. Yes. Do you enjoy village fetes? 1. I think one endures them much as one endures influenza. One is told they do good, but they leave everybody cross and overfed. Miss West smiled. And after today? Violet glanced at her quickly. 1. After today I shall do very little more here. You are leaving on Monday, if possible. The answer was quiet, but it carried the force of a conclusion already made and privately defended. Before Miss West could say more, 1. Giles appeared, carrying a basket. 1 at the raffle. Violet, I've brought you 3 jars of apricot jam, 2 bars of scented soap, and what seems to be a mechanical egg timer. How useful, said Violet. 1. It will remind us when life is overboiled. Mrs. Harbury, hearing the last phrase as she approached, said, If life is overboiled in this house, Giles, it is because you have never recognized a limit to heat. Giles's smile held. 1. But only just. My dear aunt, all my limits are financial. You have seen to that. For a second, the air between them felt charged. Then Mrs. Harbury turned away to answer some question about the raffle books. 1. And the moment dissolved into movement and afternoon light. Miss West thought, He is afraid, not merely worried. Afraid, by 6 o'clock the stalls were being dismantled. 1. Villagers went home to change for evensong, and the supper to follow on the Bella Court terrace. The lawns emptied, the sky softened, and the first real hush of evening began to gather under the trees. 1. At Willow Cottage Hester dressed in grey silk, and a hat which looked as though it had once been intended for a younger woman, and had since developed convictions of its own. Miss West wore a dark blue dress, a string of pearls. 1. And the mild expression which so often caused energetic people to mistake her for harmless. My dear, said Hester as they set out for church, if there is any fresh scandal tonight, you must let me be the first to hear it. Hester. 1. One does not summon scandal. It comes of its own accord. Yes, but it may be encouraged. St. Jude's at Evensong was very beautiful. The old stone held the day's warmth, the west light pooled in the nave. 1. And the smell of lilies and polish rose from the chancel. Villagers filed into their pews wearing those expressions of brushed propriety which mark the transition from fate to worship. Mr. Simon Bell, in surplice and mild alarm. 1. Arranged his books. Miss Dora Bell tested the organ with an expression suggesting she had never forgiven it its existence. Mrs. Augusta Harbury sat in the front pew on the left. Violet Dean was behind her. 1. Giles came in late and slid quietly into place. Leonard Pike moved near the vestry door, conferring briefly with one of the bell-ringers, Adam Hales, a young man from the ironmonger's shop. Dr. Fane stood near the back. 1. During the psalm Miss West observed a tiny movement. A church lad passed along the aisle distributing hymn books left at the rear, and with them, apparently, a folded note. Mrs. Harbury took the note. 1. Opened it once under the cover of the pew, and read. Her face did not change, but one gloved hand closed more firmly on the paper. There it was again, that sense of drama gathering itself. 1. After the final hymn, the congregation streamed out into the churchyard. where the dusk had turned the grass silver grey and the old gravestones into irregular shadows. The bell ringers climbed the tower stair. People stood in groups, waiting for the restored bells to sound properly for the first time. The lawns of Bel Air Court lay beyond the yews, lanterns already shining on the terrace where supper tables had been set. Mrs. Harbury spoke sharply to Violet. Go back to the house. I shall follow shortly. Would you like me to wait? Violet asked. No, Giles said lightly. Aunt Augusta, you are behaving like a character in a warning tale. My dear Giles, she said. That depends on who is being warned. Then, instead of taking the path towards the court, she turned past the side of the church and went towards the vestry door and lower tower entrance. Miss West noticed because everyone else was moving away. A few moments later she saw Leonard Pike say something to Miss Dora Bell, hesitate, and then follow in the same direction. At that instant the first great note of the peal rang out overhead. It was splendid. The tenor spoke deep and bronze-rich into the evening, then was joined by the others until the air over Bramwell Parva seemed to turn and move with sound. Villagers stood smiling in the churchyard. Some looked up at the tower. Children shrieked and were hushed. Hester clasped her hands in approval. One does feel, she said, that England ought always to sound exactly like this. It often has, said Miss West, though not always for happy reasons. The bells rang for perhaps 8 or 9 minutes in ordered changes, then ceased. There was a brief shifting of bodies, talk resuming, heads turning towards the path to Bel Air Court. Miss West and Hester had just begun to walk when from the church there came 2 slow distinct tolls. Dong, a pause, dong. They were solemn, deliberate, and unlike the peal. Not joyful ringing now, but the measured speech of one bell struck with intention. People stopped at once. Conversation thinned. What on earth? Said Hester. From the side door of the church burst Adam Hales, white-faced and breathless. Dr. Fane, quickly. Sir, please, quickly. By the time they crowded into the lower tower chamber, Dr. Fane was already kneeling on the worn stone stair. Mrs. Augusta Harbury lay crumpled 3 or 4 steps up, one arm beneath her, head awkwardly turned, one shoe partly off as though twisted in falling. Her face, seen in the dim light from the door, had the stillness which even amateurs recognise. What has happened? Giles demanded. Dr. Fane looked up slowly. I am afraid she is dead. There are moments in English life when every person present, whatever their upbringing, becomes suddenly and simply human. The correct phrases fall away, one's hat is forgotten, and grief or fear enters without etiquette. A little gasp ran through the group. Violet Dean, who had come hurrying back from the path, stood motionless, one hand on the doorframe. Miss Dora Bell said, "Oh Lord," in the tone of a woman who meant it. Leonard Pike came down from the upper stair, pale and hard-eyed. "She must have fallen," he said. "Good God, she must have slipped." Dr. Fane did not answer immediately. He was examining Mrs. Harbury's wrist, her throat, her face with quick professional concentration. "Please move back," he said at last. "No one is to touch anything. Mr. Bell, send for the police at once. Mr. Pike, keep the church clear." His tone was so quiet that people obeyed. Miss West stepped back into the churchyard with Hester, and stood for a moment under the yew. The tower loomed black against the paling sky. Beyond the hedge, the terrace lamps of Bel Air Court glowed on untouched supper tables. She felt, not shock exactly, but that deep inward attention which comes when one knows an event has only begun to mean itself. "An accident," Hester whispered. "Perhaps," said Miss West, but she did not think so. By 10 o'clock Inspector Malcolm Drew had arrived from Medchester. He was broad-shouldered, fair, and gave the impression of patient intelligence held firmly in reserve. He spoke little at first, examined much, took statements, sealed the church, and sent Mrs. Harbury's body back to Bel Air Court under proper arrangements. The village, disordered and frightened, dispersed at last to whisper over firesides and staircases. At Willow Cottage Hester, who had borne the evening with excited fortitude, now gave way to horror. My dear Clementine, dead on the church stair, of all places, and after paying for the bells too. It seems positively sacrilegious. "Sacrilege," said Miss West. Removing her gloves is generally only crime with better acoustics. Do not speak in that calm voice. It means you have noticed something. I have noticed several things, That Mrs. Harbury went to the tower by intention, not confusion. 1. That she had received a note in church, that Leonard Pike followed, and that the 2 tolls were not part of the peal. Hester stared. What do you mean? The Sanctus bell is rung from the lower chamber, separately. 1. Mr. Pike pointed it out this afternoon. Those 2 tolls came after the peal had ceased, and why should that matter? My dear, when one hears a solemn bell after a death, one assumes meaning. People are very obedient to bells. 1. Hester opened her mouth, then shut it again. The next morning the police began in earnest. Dr. Fane informed Inspector Drew that while the fall had caused terrible injury, he did not think it fully explained the death. 1. There were signs of sudden weakness or giddiness before the fall. Later examination suggested that Mrs. Harbury had traces of chloral hydrate in her system. Not a great quantity. 1. But enough to make an older woman unsteady if taken recently and in concentrated form. Could it have been medicine? Drew asked. It could, said Dr. Fane. Chloral is old-fashioned but not unknown. Sleeping draughts, sedatives. 1. It might equally have been given deliberately. And the bruise on the wrist? Dr. Fane's face remained grave, consistent with a grip. So Bramwell Parva awoke to murder. By breakfast time the word had not yet been used publicly. 1. But every cottage had already arranged itself around the possibility. Mr. Simon Bell prayed for Mrs. Harbury and for the guidance of the authorities, which was the closest he ever came to public drama. 1. Mrs. Gell declared privately that she had sensed currents all week. 1. Miss Dora Bell said the church was not built for melodrama, and she was not going to have the lower chamber referred to as the scene by people who could not tell a vestry from a font. 1. Inspector Drew called on Hester and Miss West after luncheon. I understand, he said, notebook in hand, that you were among the last to see Mrs. Harbury in the churchyard. Yes, said Miss West. 1. She left the path and went towards the side door. Mr. Pike followed after a short interval. Drew wrote that down. He says she wished to discuss some final details of the Bell Fund accounts and that he went after her. 1. But did not find her at once. Indeed, said Miss West. You sound doubtful. My dear Inspector, I am old. Old people are not doubtful so much as difficult to satisfy. He smiled despite himself. Did you observe anything else? 1. She had received a note during the service. Folded small. She read it and kept it. Drew looked up sharply. No one mentioned that. Perhaps no one else saw. That may be important. Yes, said Miss West. I imagine it will be. 1. When he had gone, Hester said, You like him. I like his ears. He listens before he asks the next question. It is uncommon. The day unfolded in interviews. 1. Giles Harbury told the inspector his aunt had been irritable all week and had spoken vaguely of settling matters after the ceremony. He admitted asking her again for money on Thursday and being refused. 1. Violet Dean acknowledged that she had given notice and intended to leave Bel-Air Court on Monday. Mrs. Crome reported hearing raised voices between Mrs. Harbury and Leonard Pike in the morning room 2 days earlier. 1. Dr. Fane confirmed previous disagreements with Mrs. Harbury, but denied seeing her alone that evening. Leonard Pike admitted that the Bell Fund accounts were under review, but insisted there had been no impropriety. 1. By tea time, the village had produced the first full crop of motives. Giles had money difficulties and expected to inherit Bel-Air Court. If his aunt meant to alter her will, he had reason to fear it. Violet Dean, 1. Under threat of dismissal and ruined references, might have been driven to desperation. Leonard Pike, if irregularities in the Bell accounts existed, had reason to fear exposure. Dr. Fane, some said, 1. Had quarrelled bitterly with Mrs. Harbury over medical matters, and over what she called his neglect of old parishioners. Mrs. Crome had a son in prison, whom Augusta Harbury had once refused to help. 1. Which instantly made her suspicious, in the eyes of people who thought grief hereditary. Miss West heard all this, as she always heard village theories, with courtesy and inward economy. Too many motives are often as revealing as too few. 1. When everyone seems possible, one must begin looking not for anger, nor even opportunity, but for the precise kind of mind that would arrange a death to look accidental, and then trust a bell to help. 1. On Monday morning the solicitor from Medchester arrived. Mr. Naylor was a dry man with sparse hair and a face which suggested he had spent years disliking emotional surprises in other people. From him, after proper hesitation, 1. Inspector Drew learned what Hester had already suspected. Mrs. Harbury had indeed intended to see him that day. Her most recent will left Bel-Air Court and the bulk of her estate to Giles Harbury, with legacies to Violet Dean, Mrs. Crome, 1. Several charities, and a moderate benefaction to St. Jude's. But in her letter asking him to come, Augusta had written that she was reconsidering loyalties. That phrase spread through the village by noon and improved in transit. 1. What exactly does it mean? Hester asked Miss West as they sat beneath the apple tree in the cottage garden. It means, said Miss West, shelling peas, that a woman with money wished several people to feel uncertain at once. 1. Then Giles had a motive. Yes, so did anyone expecting a legacy, a position, a favour, or merely the continuation of influence. Hester sighed. You do so hate straightforward wickedness. My dear, 1. Straightforward wickedness is rare. People usually commit crimes in the hope of continuing something comfortable. Later that day, Miss West went to the church with Hester under the pretext of admiring the memorial brass. 1. In truth, she wished to see the lower tower chamber again, this time in daylight and without crowding. Miss Dora Bell, who had stationed herself by the porch as a human barricade against sensational visitors, 1. Allowed them in because she liked Hester and was secretly flattered by Miss West's manner of taking churches seriously. The lower chamber smelled of stone dust, old rope, and brass polish. Light came through a narrow slit window, 1. Falling across the stair where Mrs. Harbury had fallen. The separate sanctus rope hung to one side near a small screen. Miss West stood very still. Is it this one? She asked. Yes, said Miss Dora. The sanctus, 1. Leonard is absurdly proud of it. It sounds different from the great tenor. Of course it does. Shorter, brighter, more pointed. But villagers would still take 2 solemn tolls to mean something. My dear Miss West, 1. Villagers would take 1 spoon dropped in the vicarage pantry to mean something. Miss West smiled. Then her eye was caught by a faint smear on the edge of the 3rd stair from the bottom. She bent slightly. What is this? 1. Miss Dora peered. Probably candle grease. Adam Hales had a hand lantern when he ran down after the peal. Did he? Yes, at least I thought so. The smear was red, not white, not candle grease, something waxier. 1. Miss West said nothing. On the way out she touched the sanctus rope again, lightly. The bell answered with the faintest whisper above. Villagers hear what they expect. That afternoon she called on Mrs. Edith Crome at Bel-Air Court. 1. The housekeeper received her in a room near the back stairs, where a black range kept constant heat and no object ever appeared to have been moved except for necessity. This is a dreadful business, Mrs. Crome said, 1. Stiff with loyalty and grievance. The maids are all upset. Mr. Giles has taken to wandering about with cigarettes, and the village is behaving as if we were a theatre. Villagers always do, said Miss West. They simply lack a curtain. 1. You have come to ask questions. Yes. About Mrs. Harbury's mood during the last week. Mrs. Crome folded a dishcloth with finality. She was very put out. There were papers in the morning room all week. Church accounts, letters. 1. Her will case. She had words with Mr. Giles on Thursday. She had words with Mr. Pike on Friday. She had words with Miss Dean whenever Miss Dean came within range. About what? About leaving. About gratitude. 1. About how a woman in Miss Dean's position ought to behave. And what position was that? Mrs. Crome tightened her lips. Sheltered one. Miss West let that pass. Did Mrs. Harbury say anything specific about Mr. Pike? 1. A curious look came into the housekeeper's face. She said he confused service with possession. I did not understand what she meant, but she was very angry. That, thought Miss West, was clear enough. 1. At dinner that evening, Hester reported another rumour. Mrs. Gell says Violet Dean was seen at Medchester station last month with Adam Hales. The bell ringer, said Miss West. Yes. Looking intimate. 1. Whatever that means at a railway platform. If it is true, then perhaps Violet is leaving Bel-Air Court to marry him. Miss West considered Adam Hales was a respectable young man of 24, earnest, broad-shouldered. 1. Steady in the ironmonger's shop, and one of the keenest ringers in the parish. A secret engagement between him and Violet Dean would be enough to alarm Augusta Harbury. 1. Who liked to arrange the future of those around her according to her own standards of suitability. Did Augusta know? Miss West asked. Mrs. Gell naturally assumes so. Mrs. Gell assumes most things with appetite. Still, 1. The matter was worth remembering. On Tuesday, Inspector Drew returned with new information. The Bell Fund accounts, though outwardly respectable, contained discrepancies. Nothing dramatic, no vanished fortunes, 1. No theatrical embezzlement, but a series of undocumented transfers and reimbursements sufficient to make any treasurer uneasy. Was money missing? Hester asked eagerly. Perhaps, Drew said, or perhaps covered badly. 1. We are still untangling it. And Mrs. Harbury knew? She had demanded the full ledger. Miss West said quietly. Then Leonard Pike had more to fear than criticism. Drew nodded. Yes, was the note found? Not whole. 1. A scrap of paper was clenched in Mrs. Harbury's glove, torn, possibly part of the note she received. Has it been compared with anything? He looked at her. Not yet. Why? A man like Mr. Pike keeps memorandum books, lists, estimates. 1. Committee points. He strikes me as a tear-a-page type rather than a casual loose paper type. Drew smiled slightly. You dislike him. My dear Inspector, dislike is too active. I merely recognise him. 1. That afternoon Miss West spoke to Dr. Julian Fane in his surgery, a clean and overburdened room, smelling faintly of carbolic and wet umbrellas. Chloral, she said, as he measured out something in a bottle. 1. Would Mrs. Harbury have had access? She had once or twice taken old-fashioned sleeping draughts, he replied. Not by my recent prescription. There was an old bottle in the medicine cupboard at Bel Air Court, apparently. 1. Whether she used it herself or someone gave her some, I cannot say. Would it make her very unsteady? In a concentrated dose, yes. Drowsy, confused, slow in movement. Enough to fall, if startled, certainly. 1. Miss West looked thoughtful. Doctor, suppose a woman had gone to a meeting angry but determined. Would chloral necessarily make her submissive? Not at all. It might make her less physically secure but no less verbally formidable. 1. Yes, said Miss West. That sounds exactly right. Dr. Fane set down the bottle. You have an idea. I have a discomfort. Which of us is wrong? One should never answer doctors too quickly. They expect symptoms before diagnosis. 1. He laughed. It is extraordinary how Hester's friends all sound as if they know more than they say. My dear doctor, that is because we are old enough to know that saying too much only encourages interruption. 1. On Wednesday, Miss West found the opportunity she needed. Adam Hales was in the churchyard coiling a rope under Miss Dora Bell's supervision, and Hester, who understood instinctively when she was being used as a diversion. 1. Engaged Miss Dora in a heated discussion about whether the Women's Institute had any right to borrow church chairs without entering them in the parish inventory. Miss West went to Adam. You were badly frightened on Saturday, she said. 1. Yes, miss. You found Mrs. Harbury? I did. Tell me exactly how. He looked surprised but willing. We'd finished the peal. Mr. Pike had come up before the end, then gone down again, said he wanted to see to something below. 1. When we stopped, he came back up and said the Sanctus had been rung, and we were wanted out front. I came down after the others because I'd left my cap. Then I heard a sort of movement or scrape on the stair, and saw Mrs. Harbury lying there. 1. So I shouted for Dr. Fane. Miss West's attention sharpened. Mr. Pike had gone down before you came out? Yes, miss, only for a minute. And you carried a lantern? No, miss, didn't need one. Enough light from below still. 1. There it was. Thank you, said Miss Westerdham, shifted, embarrassed. Do you think someone pushed her? My dear boy, said Miss West, I think someone very much wanted the village to hear a particular story. 1. That is never a good sign. She walked back to Hester under the limes with her thoughts tightening the wax on the stair. Miss Dora's mistaken memory of a lantern. Adam's statement placing Pike alone below for a moment. 1. The separate Sanctus bell. The 2 tolls after the peal, the note, the accounts. It was all increasingly plain. What remained less plain, and therefore important, 1, was why Leonard Pike had rung the Sanctus bell at all unless to shift the time of death in the minds of the listeners. Bells tell people what to feel. 1. A solemn toll after the peal would fix itself at once in memory as the moment the tragedy became public. If Mrs. Harbury had already fallen, or been dying before that, Pike bought himself something invaluable. Confusion. 1. That evening Hester said, You have that expression again. What expression? The one that means some human being has behaved like a perfect specimen of his type. My dear, that could describe almost everybody. 1. She went to bed but did not sleep quickly. The church tower stood dark beyond the elms. From somewhere in the lane came the faint rattle of a bicycle. She thought of Augusta Harbury, proud and controlling, 1, going up the side of the church in evening silk, with a note in her glove and anger in her head. She thought of Leonard Pike, exact and self-righteous, the sort of man who believes his own usefulness has made him indispensable. 1. Such men do not usually begin by intending murder. They intend correction. They intend silence. They intend to prevent humiliation. And then, when life resists them, they cross a line almost resentfully. 1. As if the victim had forced bad manners upon them. On Thursday morning, Inspector Drew came again. This time he carried in his face the look of a man who has been obliged to admit that an elderly woman may be right. 1. The paper scrap from Mrs. Harbury's glove, he said, taking tea because Hester would not permit otherwise, matches a memorandum book from Pike's desk. Same paper, same ruling, and there are pages torn out. Yes, said Miss West. 1. We also checked on the wax. It appears to be red sealing wax. Pike keeps some in the parish cupboard for sealing church correspondence and parcels. Hester gave a little gasp of triumph. What did I tell you, Clementine? 1. It was not candle grease at all. No, said Miss West, and Adam Hales carried no lantern. Drew looked interested. He told you that? Yes. He also placed Pike below before the others came down. The inspector nodded slowly. 1. That aligns with what he told me this morning. Why didn't he mention it clearly before? Because young men assume small intervals do not matter unless someone older asks them to think. It is one of the minor tragedies of civilization. 1. Drew smiled. There is more. Mrs. Crome now remembers seeing Mrs. Harbury with a folded note before the service. 1. Violet Dean says Augusta told her after tea that if Leonard Pike lied once more she would have the truth before the whole parish. Ah, said Miss West. That was foolish of her. Of Pike? No, of Augusta. 1. People who enjoy exposure often forget how dangerous disgrace can seem to the exposed. Drew leaned forward. You know what happened. Yes, said Miss West. Enough of it. Hester put down her cup with theatrical care. My dear child. 1. Then for goodness sake go on. Miss West folded her hands. Mrs. Harbury received a note during the service, almost certainly from Leonard Pike or by his arrangement. It asked to detain him in the lower tower chamber after evensong. 1. He needed a private meeting because she had demanded the accounts and intended, I think, not merely to question him, but to humiliate him. She went because she liked confrontation when she believed herself in command. 1. That sounds like Augusta, said Hester. Pike followed. There was an argument in the lower chamber or on the stair. 1. She may already have been a little unsteady from chloral taken earlier, possibly from an old sleeping draught in the house, possibly from something he offered her under pretext. That point may never be perfectly proved. 1. What matters is that she tried to pass him on the stair, or to leave. He seized her wrist. She fell. Then why ring the bell? Drew asked. Because he had to rearrange the memory of the village. If he called out at once, 1. He would be the last man alone with her in a compromising place after a quarrel about money. But if a solemn 2 tolls sounded, people would attach the event to that moment. The bells ceased. The 2 tolls came. The alarm followed. 1. It made the whole thing seem sequential and ceremonial rather than immediate. Hester stared. My dear, that is horribly clever. Not clever, said Miss West. Only characteristic. He trusted bells more than people. Drew rose. 1. Will you come to Bel Air Court this evening? I'd rather confront him there with the others present. If you think useful. My dear Miss West, he said dryly. 1. At this point I think anything useful that wears pearls should be encouraged. Bel Air Court that evening seemed to have drawn itself inward. The house had never been cheerful, but now its quiet had become watchful. 1. The drawing-room lamps cast circles of yellow light on polished tables and sombre portraits. Outside the windows the lawns were already shadowed, those present gathered by request, though none could pretend not to understand why. 1. Giles Harbury stood at the mantel smoking with poor success. Violet Dean sat near the window, hands folded, her face controlled to the point of pallor. Mrs. Crome remained upright beside the door in black silk and indignation. 1. Dr. Fane stood near the bookcase. Miss Dora Bell had been invited as a parish witness and looked as if she considered the entire occasion a monstrous proof of the consequences of committee life. Leonard Pike arrived last, punctually and composed, in a dark suit and gloves he did not remove. Inspector Drew began without ceremony. "Thank you for coming. I shall be direct. We are no longer treating Mrs. Harbury's death as accidental. Certain evidence requires explanation, and Miss West has observations I wish you all to hear." Pike turned his head towards Miss West with the smallest narrowing of the eyes. Indeed. Miss West sat very straight in a small chair, her hands resting lightly on her handbag. Mrs. Harbury went to the lower tower chamber after Evensong because she received a note asking her to meet someone there. She did not go by mistake or curiosity. A scrap of that note was found in her glove. "It matches a memorandum book from your desk, Mr. Pike." Pike's face did not change. "Many people have access to parish stationery." "Yes," said Miss West. "But not all are in the habit of tearing pages from ruled notebooks and sealing small notes with parish wax." She went on before he could reply. Mrs. Harbury had demanded the Bell restoration accounts. She had confronted you earlier in the week and again on Saturday. The accounts show irregularities, perhaps not grand theft, but enough to threaten your position and your reputation, both of which I think you value rather more than truth. Giles shifted, turning away to the fire. Violet did not stir. Pike said coldly, "This is outrageous." "My dear sir," said Miss West gently, "outrage is generally only truth arriving before one is dressed for it." Hester, in a chair near the back, shut her eyes in admiration. Inspector Drew said, "Adam Hales places you below the ringers before the alarm. He says you went down, returned, and told the men the Sanctus had been rung." Pike answered quickly, "I checked the lower chamber, that is all." "Yes," said Miss West, "and in that lower chamber you rang the Sanctus bell yourself. Those 2 tolls everyone heard were not part of the peal. They were your mistake, Mr. Pike." For the first time a real change showed in him. "Mistake? You know bells too well. To you the distinction between the great tenor and the Sanctus was obvious. To the village, a solemn toll after the peal meant only one thing, a significant moment. By ringing it then, you fixed the apparent time of the tragedy in everyone's memory. You wanted confusion. You wanted Mrs. Harbury's fall attached to those 2 tolls and the public alarm, not to the private quarrel which had happened minutes earlier." There was silence. Miss Dora Bell said involuntarily, "Good heavens!" Miss West's voice remained soft. "Mrs. Harbury confronted you in the lower chamber. She may already have been slightly unsteady from chloral, though that part may never be clear. She threatened to expose your mishandling of the funds before the parish. She enjoyed power and you could not bear losing face. On the stair she turned to go, perhaps dismissing you, perhaps saying something you found intolerable. You caught her wrist. She fell, and instead of summoning help you chose calculation. Pike's gloves had creased in his hand. "This is invention," he said, but his voice was flatter now. "There is more. Red sealing wax was found on the stair. Adam Hales did not carry a lantern. Miss Dora's memory of that was mistaken. The wax came from the note, handled there in haste. Mrs. Crome heard you quarrel with Mrs. Harbury days earlier. Violet Dean heard Augusta say she would ruin you if you lied to her once more. And the account book itself gives motive enough. Violet Dean lifted her head. "She told me," she said quietly, "that if Mr. Pike had treated the church as his own purse 1 penny longer, she would see him shamed out of office before the whole village." Pike turned on her. "And you say this now?" "No one asked me whether she meant public disgrace," Violet replied. "Only whether she was angry." Miss West said, "That is often the difficulty. People answer the question put, not the one that matters." Dr. Fane stepped a little forward. "Leonard," he said, and there was tired pity in his voice, "did you give her chloral?" Pike looked at him with something like contempt. No, Miss West believed him. The chloral belonged, she suspected, to chance or to one of Augusta's own habits. It had weakened her, not killed her, but the question was useful. It exposed his indignation in the wrong place. "You wrote the note," Drew said. Pike's shoulders altered, just enough to lose their formal balance. "She meant to destroy me," he said at last. Over bookkeeping delays, over temporary borrowings, over details. After all I had done for that church. For the church, said Miss Dorabelle, 1, in a voice of pure acid. Do not flatter yourself. He ignored her. She liked making people smaller. She liked holding money and patronage over them and calling it order. She spoke to me in that tower as if I were a dishonest servant. 1. You were dishonest, said Giles harshly. Pike swung round. And you, sir, live on handouts and have the insolence to judge. I never pretended it was virtue, Giles said. Miss West intervened before the exchange could expand. 1. You caught her arm, she said. That is all it took. Pike's face, so carefully held together, seemed suddenly older. She would not listen, he said. She tried to push past me. She was unsteady already. 1. I only meant to stop her. People say that very often, said Miss West. It never helps much. He closed his eyes briefly. When she fell, I knew it was done. 1. If I had called out at once, they would have said exactly what you are saying now. Yes, said Miss West, because it was true. The room remained still for several seconds. Then Inspector Drew signalled to the constable waiting outside. 1. Pike did not resist. Men like Leonard Pike seldom do, once the pattern is named. Resistance would mean admitting that disorder had entered them. Better almost to submit to procedure and think of oneself as badly treated. 1. As he reached the door, he turned once more. She drove people to it, he said. Not loudly, Miss West looked at him with grave kindness. My dear Mr. Pike, many difficult people live to 90. The rest of us manage not to kill them. 1. He went out. When the door closed behind him, the drawing-room seemed to exhale. Giles crushed his cigarette into the grate with unnecessary violence. Good God, he said. All over columns in a ledger and wounded pride. No, 1, said Miss West. Overpower. Money merely gave it shape. Violet Dean let out a breath so slow it was almost invisible. My poor employer, she said after a moment. She would have hated being right only after death. 1. She would have hated not supervising it, said Miss West. A small, shocked laugh escaped Violet in spite of herself. Even Mrs. Crome's mouth twitched, though from disapproval or relief it was impossible to say. Later, 1. When most of them had gone and the night lay quiet over the lawns, Inspector Drew stood with Miss West in the hall. You were right, he said, about nearly everything. My dear Inspector, 1. Nearly everything is the most one can hope for where human beings are concerned. The chloral. I think chance helped him. Mrs. Harbury had likely taken something herself earlier, perhaps out of agitation. 1. He made use of weakness and then of symbolism. Drew nodded. And the bell? Yes, that was the heart of it. He trusted the village to hear solemnity and stop thinking. Bells are very good at that. So are uniforms and committees. 1. He gave a short laugh. You should have been in the police. My dear, I should have hated the paperwork. Over the next days, official matters proceeded with their usual combination of speed and delay. Leonard Pike's confession, 1. Once begun, proved partial and self-justifying, but sufficient. He admitted writing the note and arranging the meeting in the lower tower chamber. He admitted seizing Augusta Harbury on the stair and letting her fall. 1. He admitted ringing the Sanctus bell to confuse the sequence of events. He continued to insist that he had not intended her death, which may even have been true in the narrow way such men use truth. 1. But no one in authority found the distinction useful. The Bell Fund irregularities, when fully examined, showed a pattern of small appropriations and disguised reimbursements stretching over 2 years. No single sum was ruinous. 1. The ruin lay in the accumulation and the deception. Leonard Pike had not seen himself as a thief. He had seen himself as entitled to temporary rectifications. 1. There is no more dangerous form of dishonesty than that which thinks itself moral in instalments. Bramwell Parva adjusted, as villages always do. Shock became discussion. Discussion became interpretation. Interpretation became memory. 1. Mrs. Gell announced to several customers that she had never trusted men who arranged hymn numbers. Miss Dorabelle said she had always known Leonard Pike possessed the wrong sort of neatness. Mr. Simon Bell preached on pride, stewardship 1, and the peril of confusing one's own importance with God's work, though midway through the sermon he lost his place and was obliged to begin the sentence again. The congregation found this touching. 1. At Bel Air Court the weather seemed to change indoors. Augusta Harbury's presence had always been the house's central pressure, and with her gone the place felt at once emptier and larger. Mrs. Crowe moved more softly, 1. The maids whispered less. Giles wandered for 2 days in a kind of dazed release, then began, to everyone's surprise, to behave with a measure of seriousness. Mr. Naylor, the solicitor, returned. Augusta's will, not yet altered, 1. Left Bel Air Court and the greater part of the estate to Giles. There were legacies for Violet Dean, Mrs. Crome, various charities, and a further sum for St. Jude's, 1, which Miss Dorabelle declared the church would accept in proper sorrow and complete financial readiness. Hester said to Miss West over breakfast, "If there is any justice at all, 1. Giles will now marry a practical woman and spend the rest of his life apologising to chair covers. My dear, that would be too theatrical. He will probably try for virtue in smaller portions. As for Violet Dean, 1. She did indeed prepare to leave on Monday, but not in quite the manner first expected. She came to Willow Cottage that afternoon to thank Miss West, 1, wearing a plain travelling suit, and a face that looked both younger and more tired without the constant discipline of Bel Air Court around it. I wanted to say goodbye, she said. How nice, said Miss West. Hester, 1, with tact unusual but not impossible, left them together over tea. Violet sat very straight for a moment, then relaxed. I ought to tell you, she said, that Mrs. Gell's rumour was true. I was at the station with Adam Hales, 1. We are to be married in the autumn if he still wants me after all this. Miss West smiled. My dear, if a sensible young man can survive church ringing, village opinion, and a murder in the Tower, he will probably survive matrimony, 1. Violet laughed softly. Mrs. Harbury would not have approved. No. She offered me money not to leave, then threatened to ruin my references if I married beneath what she called my opportunities. That sounds like her, 1. I do not wish to speak ill of the dead. No, said Miss West. There is generally enough living evidence. Violet's eyes grew thoughtful. She was lonely, you know. Not good at kindness, but lonely. Yes, 1, said Miss West. Lonely people often mistake possession for affection. It ends badly for everybody. Violet looked down at her gloves. Did Leonard Pike truly mean to kill her? Miss West considered before answering. 1. I think he meant to stop her, then to silence consequence, then to save himself. By the time people reach the third of those, murder is usually already behind them. Violet nodded slowly, 1, as if accepting a fact she had half known before it was spoken. When she had gone, Hester returned at once. Well, she is to marry Adam Hales. My dear, then the village will dine out on that for weeks, 1. Mrs. Gell will have to enlarge her imagination. Miss West resumed her knitting. It is quite good for villagers to have romance after murder. It gives them something healthier to mishandle. A day later, Giles Harbury came to call, 1. He looked thinner, and what was more interesting, he looked less pleased with himself. This improvement gave him a much better face. I hope I'm not intruding, he said in the doorway. My dear Mr. Harbury, said Hester, 1. Intrusion is the chief purpose of civil life. Come in. He took tea awkwardly, as if uncertain whether gratitude required the holding of a cup in a special way. I suppose, he said at last to Miss West, I owe you thanks, 1. You owe Inspector Drew thanks. Yes, but he would not have arrived where he did without you. I am very glad if I was of use. Giles stared into the garden. I cannot say I loved my aunt. That would be a lie, 1. And lies have had rather a poor run lately. But the house seems extraordinary without her, as though all the furniture had been waiting for permission to breathe. Many houses do, said Miss West. He gave her a quick look, 1. I knew she was difficult. I did not quite see how much fear she created in others, or perhaps I did and found it convenient. My dear Mr. Harbury, most families are arrangements between truth and convenience, 1. The difficulty comes when convenience thinks itself permanent. He smiled crookedly. You do put things mercilessly. No, only neatly. He hesitated. I have decided not to sell Bel Air Court. That sounds wise, 1. Mrs. Crome says the roof in the north wing must be seen to. Violet has agreed to stay a month to help organise papers, and Dr. Fane, who appears to disapprove of me on principle, says idleness will finish me sooner than debt, 1. Dr. Fane is probably right. Giles laughed, then grew serious again. My aunt told me on Friday that you looked like a woman not easily managed. How flattering, said Miss West. No, said Giles quietly. How rare, 1. When he had gone, Hester said, "If he develops character, the place may yet survive him." "My dear," said Miss West, "houses often do better than heirs expect. They have had longer practice." Hester laughed. 1. "That is exactly the sort of thing I should embroider on a cushion if I had the least gift for useful work." "You have many gifts," said Miss West. "Usefulness has never been among the more decorative." The village settled, 1. Over the next few days, into that curious state which follows scandal in a place too small to absorb it quickly. Bramwell Parva did not so much recover as redistribute its emotions. Shock became certainty, certainty became opinion, 1. And opinion, after a proper interval, acquired detail enough to pass for memory. Those who had admired Leonard Pike's exactness now recalled with considerable conviction that they had always found him a trifle hard, 1. Those who had depended on his efficiency spoke of it more cautiously, as if embarrassed to have mistaken tidiness for integrity. The Bell Fund Committee, having first been appalled, then affronted, finally became determined, 1. Which is often the emotional progression by which respectable English bodies survive disgrace. At St. Jude's the lower tower chamber remained closed for several days except to the police, and to Mr. Simon Bell, 1, who went in once and came out looking so pale that Miss Dora Bell forbade him ever to enter it alone again. "It is not the place itself," she told Hester in the tea shop, 1, with the solemn satisfaction of one who has had her worst expectations morally justified. "It is the association. Stone remembers everything, I am convinced of it." "My dear Dora," said Hester, stirring sugar into her tea, 1. "If Stone remembered everything, half the county would be arrested by weather." Miss Dora, who privately enjoyed Hester's irreverence while disapproving of it as a principle, 1, replied only that people ought not to joke about murder before luncheon. The inquest took place on Friday in Medchester, and though villagers pretend to dislike publicity, 1, a surprising number of Bramwell Parva residents contrived errands in the town that morning. Hester naturally wished to go, but Miss West, who had always thought crowds at inquests a rather ghoulish form of civic participation, 1, preferred to hear the matter from Inspector Drew afterwards. He came that evening looking more tired than triumphant. "It is done," he said, accepting whisky and soda. "A formal verdict consistent with unlawful killing, 1, given Pike's confession and the evidence. There will be trial later, but the shape of it is settled." Hester leaned forward at once. "Did he say anything?" "Nothing new. He clung to the claim that he had not intended her death, 1. He admitted writing the note, arranging the meeting, seizing Mrs. Harbury on the stair, and ringing the Sanctus bell afterwards." Miss West said quietly, "And the chloral?" Drew shook his head. "Still uncertain, 1. Dr. Fane's view remains that Augusta Harbury had probably taken some from her own old sleeping draught earlier that afternoon. Mrs. Crome found the bottle in the morning room, uncorked. Whether Pike knew it or not, 1, it made her less steady and therefore more vulnerable." "That sounds like life," said Miss West, one weakness waiting for another. Hester sighed dramatically. "My dear, do not be philosophical over whisky, 1. It makes everything sound Presbyterian." Drew smiled. "There was one point I thought might interest you. Naylor, the solicitor, produced Augusta's latest memorandum, 1. She had intended not merely to question Pike before the parish, but to remove him publicly from his offices and demand a fresh appeal audit." Miss West nodded. "Yes. A woman like Mrs. Harbury would always prefer correction with witnesses, 1. It would have ruined him socially." "My dear Inspector, social ruin is often more frightening to that type of man than prison. Prison lasts a number of years. Humiliation lives in church porches indefinitely." Drew laughed, 1, then grew serious again. "I meant what I said before. Without your noticing the note, the Sanctus bell, the wax, and Adam Hales's timing, we might have taken a much longer road. You would have arrived eventually. Perhaps, 1. But by then half the village would have been poisoned by rumour. That," said Hester, "would have included me, and I object to being counted among the casualties." When he had gone, Hester sat for some time by the fireless grate, 1, though the evening was mild, twirling the stem of her glass. "It is extraordinary," she said at last, "how little people understand what will actually destroy them. One thinks of murder as rage, jealousy, something volcanic, 1. Yet here it was, bookkeeping and pride and 2 miserable bell strokes in a church. "My dear," said Miss West, taking up her knitting, "rage is often only vanity on fire. The materials are usually laid much earlier." 1. The next week brought practical rearrangements. At Belair Court Mr. Naylor moved about with parchments, keys, lists, and professional sorrow. Giles Harbury, 1. In deference to necessity and perhaps to the first genuine sense of responsibility he had ever experienced, applied himself to the business of inheritance with a diligence so unfamiliar that even Mrs. Crome, while not visibly approving, 1. ceased to regard him as a wholly ornamental defect. Miss West went to the court twice during this period, once at Giles's invitation and once at Violet Dean's request. The house had altered in mood. Without Augusta's controlling presence, 1. the rooms seemed less prepared for inspection. Flowers stood where they pleased, rather than where they were commanded. A chair in the library had actually been left at an angle. Mrs. Crome noticed and corrected this at once. 1. But the fact that it had occurred at all suggested an atmospheric change. On the first of these visits, Giles took Miss West into the morning room, where boxes of papers were spread over the table. "You see before you," he said, 1. with a wryness much improved by fatigue, "the accumulated moral architecture of Belair Court. Aunt Augusta appears to have preserved every letter since the Boer War." "That is wise," said Miss West. 1. "People who govern by information usually keep archives. She also kept lists of my failings, my school reports, every cheque she ever wrote me, and notes on the vicar's wife's flower arrangements dating back 18 years. 1. I begin to think she expected history to be cross-examined." Miss West glanced over a nearby pile. Augusta Harbury's handwriting was clear, slanting, and decisive. 1. The handwriting of a woman who not only came to conclusions but filed them alphabetically. She felt unexpectedly a little pity. She was very lonely, was she not? Giles looked up from a deed box. "Yes," he said after a moment. 1. Though she would rather have died than hear it. My uncle was easygoing and ineffective. She despised ineffectiveness, so naturally she married it. After he died, 1. She ran everything because it was the only way she knew to avoid needing anyone. But of course the more one runs everything, the fewer people remain who can bear one. "Yes," said Miss West. "That happens." He leaned against the table, 1. rubbing his forehead. "I cannot quite forgive her, nor quite grieve cleanly. It is an awkward combination. My dear Mr. Harbury, most grief is awkward unless one has not known the person at all. 1. Clean grief belongs largely to novels and very young widows." That made him smile, though sadly. "She respected you, you know." Naylor found a note among her private memoranda, nothing formal, just one of her opinions. 1. Miss Clementine West. Harmless appearance, dangerous mind, not to be patronised. "How extremely flattering," said Miss West. "It is the nearest thing to praise she ever wrote of anyone." 1. On the second visit, Violet Dean asked Miss West to walk with her in the yew garden before she left for Medchester to stay with a cousin until her wedding. The clipped hedges made green walls around them. 1. And there was an old stone seat at the far end where Augusta had once sat dispensing judgments upon weather, servants, and world affairs. "I thought I should feel only relief," Violet said, after they had gone once round the central bed. 1. Instead I keep feeling guilty for not feeling more. "My dear," said Miss West, "guilt is often the first tidy cloth people throw over complicated emotions. It saves explanation." Violet gave a short, rueful laugh. 1. That is exactly what it feels like. She was impossible. She humiliated me, directed me, watched me, and would have managed my marriage if she could. Yet she also gave me security when I badly needed it. 1. She paid for my mother's nursing in those last months. She sent money to my brother when he was ill in Canada. She never spoke of any of it, except when she wished to remind me what I owed. 1. One doesn't know where gratitude ends and captivity begins. "No," said Miss West. "Very few people do." They walked a little further. "Adam wants to marry in October," Violet said. "A small wedding. Quiet. I should like that." 1. That sounds sensible. Mrs. Gell will think it suspiciously modest. Mrs. Gell thinks modesty is generally a sign that something more expensive has happened first. Violet smiled, then became grave. 1. Do you think Augusta guessed about Adam and me? Yes. You sound certain. My dear, women who arrange households always know where the emotional furniture has been moved. They may pretend otherwise for strategic reasons, 1. But they know. Violet looked back towards the house. She told me once that people marry beneath themselves not because of love, but because they are too idle to imagine a more profitable future. 1. I remember wanting to answer that some profitable futures looked very like prison, but one did not speak to Augusta in sentences like that unless one wanted the weather ruined for a week. Miss West touched the stone seat as they passed. 1. She must have been formidable when young. Oh, she was. There are still women in the village who say Augusta Harbury could organise a hunt ball, a hospital fund, and a family scandal simultaneously and not miss a tray of sandwiches. 1. Yes, said Miss West. That sort of force ages badly if it does not learn kindness on the way. The village, meanwhile, found new subjects in order to survive the old. There was a debate over whether the Bell rededication, 1, so violently interrupted, should be abandoned, postponed indefinitely, or reclaimed with dignity. Mr. Simon Bell favoured postponement until the atmosphere has righted itself. 1. Miss Dora Bell said atmosphere never righted itself, and the only proper response to disaster was a revised programme. The church committee, chastened by Pike's disgrace, and determined to prove that religion could outlast accountancy, 1. Met twice in the schoolroom. The result, after much tea and several small outbreaks of principle, was that the Bells would be rededicated quietly on the last Sunday of July, without fate, 1. Without speeches beyond what the rector could say in under 3 minutes, and with a collection for the Belframe debt conducted under triple supervision. That sounds promising, Hester said. 1. Nothing is so moral as a collection watched by women. Miss West agreed. During these weeks she saw a good deal of Inspector Drew, who had a way of dropping in when in Medchester on business, and found, she suspected, 1. Hester's tea more reliable than the police canteen. He was not a confiding man, but because he had intelligence enough to enjoy accuracy when he met it, he sometimes discussed cases with Miss West in outline. One thing still troubles me, 1, he said one evening, sitting in Hester's drawing-room with a plate of anchovy toast he had accepted, while protesting that he ought not to be fed as if he were a curate. Why did Pike trust the Bell trick at all? 1. Even if the village heard what he wanted, he could not know it would stand up under scrutiny. My dear Inspector, said Miss West, that is exactly why he trusted it. 1. Such men believe most firmly in arrangements they themselves would not question. He knew the difference between the Bells, therefore he assumed others would not. He also had years of being listened to whenever he spoke in church matters. 1. He had trained the village to accept his authority over bells and rituals. In a crisis he used the habit, Drew considered. So the crime wasn't simply opportunistic. No, opportunistic in moment perhaps, but habitual in structure. 1. Leonard Pike had spent years borrowing respectability from service. When danger came he spent it. Hester put down her mending. My dear, that is one of the nastiest and truest things I have heard in months. 1. Drew looked at Miss West with something close to admiration. You make motives sound like housekeeping. They are usually hidden in the linen cupboard, she replied. 1. It was also during this time that she came to understand more fully the precise emotional weather of Bel-Air Court. Mrs. Crome, who had at first spoken of Augusta only in terms of service and standards, 1. Thawed surprisingly one wet afternoon when Miss West called and found her alone in the still-room labelling jars. She was not an easy mistress, Mrs. Crome said, cutting string with fierce precision. 1. But there was never uncertainty while she lived. Except in other people, said Miss West. Mrs. Crome gave her a sharp look and then, unexpectedly, a brief nod. Yes, well, there is that. 1. She liked to keep a person's future slightly open, as she called it. Said certainty made servants slack and relations insolent. That is one view. It is not mine, said Mrs. Crome firmly. Still, 1. Bel-Air Court would not have stood as it does without her. Mr. Harbury, begging your pardon, meant well but had no notion of roofs or rents. Mr. Giles. She stopped, as if unwilling to condemn the present owner by habit. Mr. Giles may improve. 1. Miss West suggested. Mrs. Crome sniffed. He has begun by asking where the coal accounts are. That is something. Yes, there's another thing, Mrs. Crome said after a moment. 1. People speak as though Leonard Pike killed her over money only. I do not believe that. No, no. Money frightened him, no doubt. But what really undid him was that she had ceased to respect him. 1. Men like that cannot bear a woman's contempt if they have spent years relying on her approval. Miss West looked at the rows of labelled jars, each exact and upright. You are very shrewd, Mrs. Crome. I have run kitchens all my life. 1. Miss. One learns what really spoils men. It is seldom temptation, more often wounded importance. When Miss West repeated this to Hester, her friend exclaimed, Edith Crome has hidden talents. I always said grief might improve. 1. My dear, grief improves almost nobody, said Miss West. It merely removes the need for certain pretences. The summer moved on. Hay was cut in the fields beyond the village. 1. Roses overblew in the cottage gardens and were replaced by phlox and white lilies. The first blackberries began to show in the hedges. At Willow Cottage the afternoons grew drowsy with heat. 1. And Hester took to napping over the Times in a way she fiercely denied if woken. Miss West herself found the pace agreeable. She liked English villages in the latter half of summer. 1. When excitement had spent itself and habits resumed command. The postman still arrived. Chickens still escaped. Someone still objected to the rector's sermon. Such continuities seemed to her the real basis of civilization. Not grand laws. 1. Nor public ideals, but the repeated proof that ordinary life insisted on carrying on after people had behaved badly. Yet Bramwell Parva did not forget. At tea-tables and garden gates the crime lingered as a cautionary tale. 1. And with each retelling, one could hear the village deciding what moral it preferred. Some said it showed the danger of money in church matters. Some the danger of leaving too much power to one capable woman. Some, more privately, 1. Thought it demonstrated what happened when men of fixed position were crossed by women who knew too much of them. Miss West thought all these explanations partly true, and therefore not enough. One afternoon, 1. Some 10 days before the second rededication, she and Hester encountered Mrs. Beatrice Gell outside the post office arranging dahlias in a bucket. Well, said Mrs. Gell, 1. We shall see whether people can hear bells again without thinking of murder. My dear Mrs. Gell, said Hester, people can scarcely hear a bicycle bell without thinking of someone's morals. I should not worry about St. Jude's. 1. Mrs. Gell ignored this. I always say one must be careful whom one trusts with church money. It is not natural for laymen to handle sacred accounts too intimately. Then the Almighty is badly served, said Miss West. 1. For he seems to require constant roofing. Mrs. Gell blinked, uncertain whether she had been agreed with or contradicted, and was therefore quiet for almost half a minute. 1. That same week Adam Hales came to Willow Cottage on an errand from the ironmonger's, and, being detained by Hester for cake, ended by staying a quarter of an hour longer than intended. He was a good young man, Miss West thought, 1. In the solid unornamental way that often proves most dependable. I am glad Miss Dean is going away for a bit, he said awkwardly, turning his cup in his hand. The village means well, but it does talk. Villagers always talk, 1, said Miss West. If they stopped, one should suspect epidemic or revolution. He smiled slightly. I only mean, she had enough from all this, people looking at her as if they wonder what she must have known. She knew nothing about Pike, 1. She only knew Mrs. Harbury could be difficult. That is often all anyone knows, said Miss West. He hesitated. Do you think it will follow us? The business, I mean. My dear Mr. Hales, everything follows people a little in villages. 1. The secret is to go on so steadily that gossip tires before you do. He nodded, reassured perhaps not by the words themselves so much as by her confidence in them. After he had gone, Hester said, He is a thoroughly respectable young man. 1. That may be exactly what Violet Dean needs after Belair Court. Yes, said Miss West. Respectability is very underrated when it is honest. Hester glanced at her. You are feeling benevolent. No, only practical. 1. Romance is all very well, but marriages are more often saved by reliable boots in winter than by moonlight. The rededication of the bells came at last on a still, bright Sunday near the end of July. Bramwell Parva had chosen, wisely, 1, to make little fuss. There were flowers in church, but not extravagantly so. Mr. Simon Bell had pared his remarks to a merciful brevity. The collection plate was carried not by one churchwarden, 1, since there was not yet a replacement for Pike, but by Colonel Masters from the Manor Farm and Mr. Alton the schoolmaster, both men of such mutual suspicion that any fraud between them would have required a miracle. 1. Miss West went with Hester to the morning service and sat midway down the nave. She observed with interest how the village had redistributed itself. Giles Harbury, for once punctual, 1. Sat in the Harbury pew, not with inherited ease but with a kind of attentive sobriety. Mrs. Crome was behind him in black, upright as duty itself. Violet Dean had returned quietly from Medchester for the day and sat beside Miss Dora Bell. 1. Adam Hales was with the ringers, of course, though he came down later for the service proper, hair damp and collar slightly askew. Dr. Fane stood near the back. Mrs. Gell wore a hat suggesting memorial intentions. 1. The service passed without disruption. Mr. Simon Bell preached on restoration, which could have been awful but turned out instead to be gentle and unexpectedly sincere. 1. He spoke of broken things mended not into perfection but into continued use, and of communities which do not become spotless by suffering but may, if they are fortunate, become a little truer. It is not given to us, he said. 1. Glancing up with earnest confusion at his own best sentence, to remove from life all the cracks made by pride and grief and wrong, but it is given to us to choose what sounds through them afterwards. 1. Miss West thought that very good indeed, though she suspected Miss Dora had written half of it. After the final blessing the congregation moved into the churchyard under a sky, so blue it made every stone look whiter. 1. The ringers climbed the tower. This time there was no suspense, only expectation chastened by memory. Then the bells began. The great tenor spoke first, deep and full, and the others followed, clear and ordered. 1. The sound moved over the roofs, the pond, the meadows, and the distant line of trees where the road ran to Medchester. Children stopped to listen. Even Mrs. Gell looked softened. "They sound better," Hester murmured. "No," said Miss West. 1. We only hear them without deceit now. It was true. Nothing in the bells themselves had changed. Bronze does not moralize. It speaks as it is struck. 1. Yet the village heard them differently because their last public meaning had been reclaimed from terror and from Leonard Pike's manipulation. There was something very English, Miss West thought, about such a reclamation. Not grand, 1. Not theatrical, but stubborn. One would have the proper bell for the proper purpose, and no murderer should keep even a tone of it. Afterwards there was coffee in the church hall. 1. Coffee in English village halls has always seemed to Miss West one of the great tests of civilization, being usually too hot, too thin, or too earnest, but the occasion lent even that some dignity. People spoke more freely now. 1. And one felt the village loosening its shoulders. Giles came over with Violet and Adam. "Well," he said, "we have done it. St. Jude's remains Christian, and the bells remain solvent." "An excellent combination," said Miss West. 1. Violet looked genuinely happy for the first time in Miss West's acquaintance with her. Adam says the tenor settled better in the third course than it did on the rehearsal. "It did," said Adam, brightening at once. 1. There was a cleaner swing to it. "My dear," said Hester, "any young man who can make church mechanics sound like a declaration of love deserves marrying promptly." Adam blushed to the roots of his hair. Violet laughed. Giles said, 1. I have asked Miss Dean and Mr. Hales to have the wedding breakfast at Bel-Air Court in October if they wish it. Violet stared. "That is very kind." "It is partly guilt," Giles replied. 1. But also an effort at behaving like the owner of a house, rather than its most decorative debt. Mrs. Crome, who had approached in time to hear this, said, "If the breakfast is held at Bel-Air Court, 1. The silver will need going over next month," which was, from her, a sweeping benediction. Later, as people drifted home under the noon sun, Miss West and Hester walked slowly along the lane by the green. Bees moved in the lavender. 1. And from a distant field came the sound of a tractor reminding the century that it had advanced even if villagers preferred not to mention it. "You look pleased," said Hester. "I am. At what? The bells?" "At the bells, yes." 1. And at Mr. Simon Bell's sermon, which I had not thought possible, and at Giles Harbury's first signs of moral adulthood. "My dear, you ask a great deal. A sermon, bells, and moral adulthood all in one morning." "Yes," said Miss West. 1. But one should enjoy abundance when it occurs. It is so seldom punctual. The wedding of Violet Dean and Adam Hales took place in October exactly as planned, and because Hester would not hear of Miss West returning home before then, 1. Her visit was extended by persuasion, weather, and the comfortable fact that no one at St. Mary Mead, or as Hester teasingly called it, that other nest of embroidered wickedness you come from, was expecting her urgently. 1. Early autumn in Bramwell Parva proved as agreeable as late summer. The hedges reddened. Wood smoke began in the evenings. The first mists appeared over the lower meadow beyond Bel Air Court. The wedding itself was quiet. 1. As Violet had wished, but Bel Air Court gave it a dignity it might otherwise have lacked. Mrs. Crome supervised the breakfast with such stern perfection that even the sandwiches appeared to have been morally improved. 1. Giles behaved admirably, said Little, and looked sincerely pleased. Miss Dora Bell played the organ a shade too loudly from emotion rather than vanity. Mr. Simon Bell nearly lost the ring but recovered it from his own prayer book. Mrs. Gell, 1. In heliotrope, wept where she could be seen and denied it immediately after. Miss West sat beside Dr. Fane at the breakfast table and found him less dry than usual. "You look happier," she said as coffee was poured. "My dear Miss West, 1. He replied. "Nothing improves a village doctor's spirits like the sight of two sensible people doing something straightforward at the proper time. That is a very narrow form of romance. It is the only medically approved one. 1. She smiled. And Bel Air Court. He glanced towards Giles, who was listening respectfully to Mrs. Crome on the subject of preserving pears. Harbury may yet become tolerable. That sounds from you like high praise. 1. It is nearly a testimonial. There was dancing in the drawing-room afterwards for those young enough to enjoy it without irony. Hester, who was not young enough but possessed irony in abundance, 1. Refused to dance, and instead stationed herself near the window with Miss West and conducted an appreciation of everybody else's errors in footing. "My dear," she whispered, as Giles asked a thin, sensible girl from Medchester to dance. 1. "Who is that, Miss Eleanor Swain?" said Miss West. "Naylor's niece, I think. She has the look of someone who knows the price of curtains. Excellent. Giles may at last be guided into matrimony by the linen cupboard. 1. Let us not overplan his future," said Miss West. "Houses improve faster than men." As autumn deepened, the case itself receded into history. Leonard Pike was tried in the winter assizes and sentenced with proper solemnity. 1. The newspapers gave it a week's life and then moved on to politics, foreign worries, and a duchess's divorce. Bramwell Parva, however, retained the matter in its own fashion. Children were warned not to play on the tower stair. 1. Visitors were told in lowered voices, "This is where it happened," until Miss Dora Bell protested and altered the rota for tower showings herself. 1. The Bell Fund was completed under a new treasurer who believed passionately in duplicate receipts. Mr. Simon Bell developed a nervous but sincere habit of thanking committees publicly. Mrs. Gell lived on the story for nearly 3 years. 1. Miss West left Bramwell Parva only when November had begun to press damp fingers against the windows, and even Hester admitted that another guest in the spare room might be preferable to one more discussion about whether pheasant was overpraised. 1. On the morning of her departure the village seemed made of pearl and smoke. The green was silvered by mist. The pond held a pair of ducks looking as if they objected to the season personally. Hester fussed over scarves, sandwiches, 1, and whether the bus would be cold. Mrs. Gell came out of the post office under pretext of mailing a circular and wished Miss West a safe journey with all the satisfaction of one who has been present for an entire narrative arc. 1. At the bus stop Giles Harbury appeared unexpectedly, hat in hand. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said. "That is kind. And to tell you that the north wing roof is being done. The tenant dispute at Lower Farm is settled. 1. And Mrs. Crome says I now ask questions in a way less likely to ruin labour relations." "My dear Mr. Harbury," said Miss West, "you are becoming a landed proprietor." He laughed. "God forbid." 1. "But I am trying not to be an historical mistake. That is usually enough." He hesitated. "I have also asked Miss Swain from Medchester to spend Christmas with us." 1. Hester made a sound which she disguised as a cough so unsuccessfully that even the ducks might have been amused. Miss West only said, "How pleasant." "Yes," he said, smiling slightly. "I thought you would say something like that." 1. When the bus came at last, lumbering through the mist with all the conviction of rural transport, Hester embraced her with affectionate violence. "My dear Clementine, you have transformed my summer." "Nonsense. The village did that." 1. "Yes, but you explained it so much better. Miss West settled herself by the window as the bus pulled away. She saw Hester still waving, saw the church tower rise above the trees, saw Bel-Air Court half hidden in the morning haze like a respectable secret, saw Mrs. Gell already turning back to the post office with the determined tread of one carrying news to the day. She thought, as villagers slid slowly past, that bells are rather like people. One imagines the sound belongs wholly to the metal, the mechanism, the visible form. But much of what one hears is made by what has happened before, who rang them, why, and in what silence the notes were received. Leonard Pike had tried to borrow that truth for a lie. He had used a sacred signal to cover a profane act, trusting that habit would spare him scrutiny. Yet habit, once questioned, had undone him. So much evil, Miss West reflected, comes not from monstrous impulse, but from the small cultivated arrogance of those who think order belongs to them personally. Augusta Harbury had ruled by pressure, Pike by correctness, Giles by charm, Violet by self-command, Hester by affection and curiosity, Mrs. Gell by information. Every village is an orchestra of little dominions. Most of the time the sounds merely annoy one another. Occasionally, if vanity is crossed and fear enters at the wrong moment, something darker is struck. The bus reached the rise beyond the village. From there, through the thinning mist, St. Jude's Tower stood clear, and as if on cue. Though villagers never truly manage coincidence, they only recognise it too late. The noon bell began to ring one note, then another, then the proper ordered peal for an ordinary day. No false sanctus, no warning disguised as ritual. Only bell metal, carrying across damp fields while life, having endured folly, once again resumed its patient course. Miss West smiled to herself and settled her gloves more comfortably in her lap. That one, she thought, was perhaps the nearest one came to justice in such places. Not complete amendment, not perfect grief, not even morality, which is usually too tired after an inquest to stand very straight, but the restoration of true proportions, the right people known for what they were, the wrong sound distinguished from the right one, a house open to air, a village able at last to hear its bells without flinching. The road turned, Bramwell Parva slipped gently out of sight behind hedges and bare trees. Winter passed, spring returned, and though Miss West received letters from Hester regularly, dense with underlinings, local weather, complaints about liver, and opinions on everybody's drawing-room curtains, certain pieces of news mattered more than the rest. Giles Harbury did indeed invite Miss Eleanor Swain for Christmas, and by March had become formally engaged to her. Hester described Miss Swain as the very image of composed common sense, with ankles suitable for estate management. This Miss West took as the highest endorsement. Violet and Adam settled into the small house near the smithy which had belonged to Adam's aunt. Violet wrote once to thank Miss West again, and to report that married life was proving both quieter and less theatrical than Bel-Air Court, which she judged a triumph. A son arrived the following year and was christened Julian, to Dr. Fane's embarrassed surprise. Mrs. Crome remained at Bel-Air Court as housekeeper by universal necessity. Hester reported that she had taken Eleanor Swain in hand on the subject of linen cupboards, and that the relationship, though frosty at the edges, appeared founded on mutual respect for shelves. As for St. Jude's, the bells continued to ring. They rang for Easter, for weddings, for harvest, and once for an aged shepherd whose funeral drew half the village despite his having spoken to almost no one for 3 decades. Mr. Simon Bell retired to Bath and was replaced by a younger rector with alarming ideas about church youth clubs but a very clear tenor voice. Miss Dora Bell, left in dignified command of memory and practical outrage, continued to correct everyone about the lower tower chamber whenever visitors became morbid. Years later, when Miss West thought of Bramwell Parva, it was not first of the death on the stair that she remembered, nor of Leonard Pike's pale face, as the truth closed over him though both remained. It was of the bells on that second Sunday, properly rung, at last above the churchyard while the village stood listening, and did not know, perhaps, how much had been restored by that simple public sound. For villagers, like people, are not saved by never doing wrong. They are saved, if at all, by finding once again the true note after the false one has echoed too long. And in Bramwell Parva, where they had heard one bell used to deceive, and all the others ring honestly afterwards, they learned at last what perhaps they had known all along, that murder may silence a life, and fear may distort a moment one. But if truth is patient enough, even old stone towers will give it back in their own time.